Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Jambo. Thank you very much. My name is Alvin Mosioma. I come from Kenya, and as has been introduced, I coordinate the Tax Justice Network Africa Secretariat based in Nairobi. This is my first time in the UK, my first time in Manchester, and I really feel honored and privileged to be able to meet Christian Aid supporters and share my few submissions and experience on working on this very important issue of tax. I'm going to make my submission pretty brief because we're having a later on session on where we can be able to discuss in detail on this issue. When I was arriving at the Heathrow Airport 2 days ago, there was an ad by a company, an investment company called Accenture, and it had a picture of a ship, which reminded me of Dolly. And the message under it was, we can make more of your limited resources. And then it made me start thinking, this is what, for me, tax is all about. Africa is, as many say, a blessed country. We have huge resources, but unfortunately, these resources have not been captured for the benefit of the people. And one reason being that much of it does not remain in the country, but finds its way back to the north in form of tax havens through practices of unscrupulous multinational companies. When we started working on tax 5 years ago, there were many questions. Why should a civil society be working on tax? Tax was considered and still is considered a very complex issue, an issue for experts, and at worst, a boring issue. So when the network started, we were holding a number of campaigns, awareness-raising campaigns, to try and establish the link between tax and development. I remember a case in point where I was traveling to Zambia, and at the airport I met this gentleman from China who was also heading to Zambia, and we got talking. He told me, what do you do? I told him I work on tax. He said, oh really, that's very important. I'm very keen on meeting people who work on tax. So really, yeah, here I am. So we checked in, we sat together in the waiting room. Then I gave him my business card. Then he looked at it and saw Tax Justice Network, and he was like, tax and justice, the two don't go together. So when I gave him a brief view on how the two relate, the gentleman excused himself and moved to the next table because I guess he was expecting a different kind of tax expert. I'm no tax expert. And this is really the sad story that I studied economics, and in the many years of my studies, tax never featured in any of the courses. If it did, it was in a small case of doing how do we improve business environment. And yet, as you can all agree, in the long term, the only way for countries to stand on their own feet is when they are able to mobilize their own domestic resources to find their own development. I'm not aware of any country that has broken the chain of poverty through getting help from outside. In the short term, it's important. There are urgent needs that needs to be addressed, hunger, diseases. So aid is important, but in the long term, tax is the only sustainable source of development. To set an example of how tax can change the perceptions of society, until a few years ago, the Kenyan finance minister, shortly before the reading of the budget in June, he would prepare his draft and fly to Paris to meet the Paris Club, as it was known. That was the club of the largest donors. He would present his budget there. They would look at the budget and say, okay, this is okay, you have to cut this, you have to reduce this. And once it's approved, he will bring it to the Kenyan parliament for simply rubber stamping. The reason for this was because until that time, the larger part of the Kenyan budget was financed by resources coming from outside. There's an English adage which says that he who pays the piper calls the tune. So the more countries are dependent on their own resources, the more they are able to develop their own priorities, and priorities that are fitting their own development agenda. Indeed, to remain in the case of Kenya, under the so-called structural adjustment program, the credo there was that we need to reduce government expenditure, we need to reduce deficit. So governments were forced to do a lot of cost reduction, and they introduced the so-called cost sharing in many of the provision of public services in education and in health, in sanitation. And as a country, we didn't have any other option because much of the funding that was going into paying many of the civil servants in LD sectors was coming from money that is coming from outside. But with the reforms, particularly of the existing government, which has been in power for the last 8 years, Kenya has managed to improve a lot in terms of tax intake. And indeed today, about 98% of the recurrent expenditure, not the final budget, but the recurrent expenditure is funded by money that is raised domestically by tax. And as a result of this, the government was able to implement policies that were until that time considered unpopular, including the introduction of free primary education, which was introduced in 2002, which has seen the number of children enrollment in school increase in a period of 6 years by 60%, from about 6,000 in 2002 to about from about 6 million in 2002 to 10 million today. And this is all possible only when the government is able to rely on its own resources. But then, despite this development, the many African countries are facing huge challenges, some of them which are of domestic nature. We have seen, for instance, a huge shift towards consumption tax, which ends up burdening more the poor. At regional level, we have seen countries being involved in what you can call a race to the bottom, in terms of offering wide range of tax incentives to companies in order to attract the so-called foreign direct investment, and this has led to a huge revenue loss. But more importantly, at global level, because of the existing financial architecture, which includes high level of secrecy and low access of information, is leading to a huge outflow of resources, as Loretta said a few minutes ago, that there is a lot much more money flowing out of developing countries and in Africa as what is flowing in forms of aid. So we see a huge contradiction in terms of policy, while on one side governments are pledging to increase aid to Africa, but at the same time providing infrastructure that is facilitating the outflow of resources from Africa. It's a huge contradiction. So to finalize, I think that there is need for pressure at different levels. On our part, we are trying to mobilize citizens to be able to perceive themselves as taxpayers. Particularly in many African countries, as you might be aware, there is a huge informal sector, high level of unemployment, and this has led to many citizens not viewing themselves as taxpayers, and any kind of services that they get from government, they perceive that as favors. So we see our work in terms of raising that awareness and making citizens feel that they are part of they are stakeholders in the government economic processes, particularly, as I said, through the increase of VAT, which is an hidden tax. We are trying to unveil this shroud and ensure that citizens, when they perceive themselves as taxpayers, they'll be able to make a stake at the decision-making process of the country. Secondly, at the international level, we feel that there is an obligation, particularly from the citizens of the North, to question this kind of policy incoherency of their governments in terms of asking, what is it that you are doing to ensure that the resources that are generated in the South do actually remain there to be able to address poverty? I'd like to finish with an example of what is happening at the moment. We recently had visitors coming from Germany, and they were asking, yeah, why are you having constant power blackouts in this country? Don't you have enough power generation equipment plants? I told him, really, there's a link between the Kenya power shortages and the island of Jersey, which is not very apparent. The former managing director of the power plant colluded with a Finnish company to be able to receive kickbacks, which were then siphoned away and are now siphoned away to the island of Jersey in order to get that contract. And in return, the managing director would close his eyes in terms of what kind of equipment that this company was providing. Right now, as we speak, the island of Jersey has actually submitted to the Kenyan government for an extradition of these two gentlemen. One was the former finance minister, to be able to come to Jersey and face the court in terms of tax evasion and this corruption practice. So there is, although from the broad sense you might not be able to see it, we are living in a world that is interlinked. What companies do in Kenya is very much linked to what companies are doing in Jersey, and we see it as our role, our responsibility to unveil this and make the world a fairer place. Thank you for listening.